Says we're recording, so I trust it. I trust technology. I'm a trustworthy guy, but we are recording these because Facebook is still being silly. But that's okay. We'll be back going live here in the next couple of weeks, I am sure. These are constitutional deep dives with Eric Buchanan. They are offshoots of conversations of, by, and for the people that we have on Mondays with Eric Buchanan and Matthew Durham. That on that podcast, we take headlines and we give a little perspective. We give our opinions on them. And we move through 3 to 7 headlines every week. I think you'll enjoy it because we try to push each other back on each other's opinions every now and then because we don't want to be echo chambers. But they're good conversations. These conversations, we kind of keep the opinions out of it for the most part. Sometimes one of us screws up more than the other one. That's probably me, where I'll give my opinion more than the really smart guy. And just so we know, we are not going to be solving the problem or the issue as if there are aliens in Miami. We're not going to be talking about that today. However, I'm going to be doing a personal podcast on that one pretty soon, I think. That is fascinating. So let's take this off and then let's bring up Eric Buchanan because he's the man in charge. Eric Buchanan, 3, 2, 1. How you doing today, buddy?
Hey, Clint, how are you? I heard it was aliens in Berlin. That's what I saw on social media this morning.
No, it's aliens in Miami, dude. There's
And
100.
Berlin, apparently.
Really? Oh my
Yeah.
God. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
We'll
now.
see. If anybody ever gets to listen to this, if the alien invasion hasn't wiped everybody out by the time we get to talk about this. If you are listening to this, ladies and gentlemen, it means the alien invasion didn't happen. You got nothing to worry about.
It just hadn't got to us yet. And if you're an aliens listening to this, if you redo things, please keep our Constitution. Our Constitutions work really well.
There you go. That's
There you go.
exactly what
Tell
we need to do.
everybody who you are and what you do, and then we'll jump into talking about things that aren't alien related.
Hey, everybody. My name is Eric Buchanan. By profession, I'm a disability insurance attorney. We help people all over the United States who have been denied long-term disability, private disability insurance, life insurance, health insurance, or long-term care cases. So at buchanandisability.com is where we can be found on the World Wide Web. We have 6 attorneys. We work with local attorneys all over the United States. So anywhere in the United States, if you have an insurance company that's refusing to pay your claim, that's giving you a runaround, that's not paying a loved one or family member, please look us up on the World Wide Web at buchanandisability.com. We've been doing this for a long time, and we're very good at helping people who have those kind of problems. My background is that I grew up here in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where we're recording this actually on Signal Mountain, which is a suburb. Went to the Virginia Military Institute, majored in history. I also got a commission in the Navy. I graduated from flight school about a year and a half later, and then went and flew P3s in the Navy. Served for about a total of 5.5 years. Went to law school at Washington and Lee, where I paid a special attention to constitutional law and some other extra classes in the history of the law in the United States. So I like talking about the history of the United States, especially from a legal and constitutional perspective, which is how, Clint, you and I ended up doing this podcast that we've been doing now for
Couple
right
years,
around those 70 early
73.
73 or so episodes, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and real quick, one of the reasons we were doing it too is we kept running into on the podcast of By and for the People these headlines that were like people were like, we just need to do away with the Electoral College. We just need to do away with
the Senate.
why can't we pack the Supreme Court? All of these things, and we were like, I don't think some folks remember why things were put in place and how it's changed. And so the genesis of this conversation was basically, why don't we go line by line through the Constitution and Bill of Rights and remind people why they were put in place and how they may not be used exactly like they were intended, or they are. We don't know until we have conversations.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary of where we are and how we got here. And so, yeah, this is a lot of detail, but I've had some good feedback from people that enjoy listening to this.
Oh yeah,
we try to work in a few stories, a few famous cases along the way. Some of this stuff is extremely crucial in today's modern world, and important questions are being asked. And some of this stuff is like, oh, that's a fun bit of history. I'm glad to know that happened. And today's kind of a combination of that.
yeah. Article
Today,
1, Section 8, Clause 11, Part 2, letters of marque and reprisal, sir.
yes. So let's I'm going to do the quick summary I've been doing, and I apologize for people who've been listening regularly. You can hit fast forward for a few seconds while I do this again, but I'm just going to talk about the structure of the Constitution and where we are in that structure. The first article in the Constitution, Article 1, describes the powers of Congress. Article 2 describes the power of the presidency. Article 3, the power of the judiciary. Article 4, the relationships between the states and the federal government. And then there's a few other articles after that, and then the amendments. What's important about Articles 1, 2, 3, and 4 is that's where we get the separation of powers. There are
Right.
certain powers that Congress has, there's certain powers that the president has, there's certain powers that courts have, and there's certain powers that the states have if those powers are not delegated to Congress. So part of the structure of the Constitution is that states have what's called plenary police power. They can pass laws on any legal topic, anything that a government could normally regulate, that's up to the states, whether it's divorce law or criminal law or tort law, which covers things like car wrecks and injuring other people on purpose. Just about anything falls within the state's gambit. But the way the Constitution balances all that out is they say, okay, but if the federal government has power to regulate it, then the federal government's laws are going to be supreme and they get to be controlling. But it has to be something on the list of things that the federal government is allowed to pass a law about. And so Article 1, Section 8 is sort of the menu of those items that the federal government is given permission to write laws about. Congress can't write a law about anything. It has to be something found in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 is the main list of those things that a law can be written about. There's also some other stuff later in the Constitution and some stuff in a few amendments, but this is the main list. And we worked our way through it, and we covered Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, the first part. Congress has the power to declare war. That was in our last podcast.
Right.
Today, we're going to cover the rest of that clause. So, Clause 11, Congress has the power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Big picture, letters of marque and reprisal are basically permission to allow a private warship, a captain of a private warship, to go out and capture enemy ships during a time of war. Rules concerning captures on land and water, most historians say that has to do with capturing the property of an enemy country during a time of war. But it may, according to some recent stuff, also apply to what we do with prisoners from a foreign country. So that's the topic today that we're going to get into.
Okay. And we're going to talk, I think there's a couple of cases, an older one and a newer one, and we're going to talk about it through the lens of those cases.
Lens of a few famous cases.
Yeah.
So let's talk about letters of marque and reprisal. Is kind of a fun topic because basically here's what it is. Clint, when I someday am in Congress and I'm going to ask them to pass a law granting to Clint Powell a letter of marque that gives you permission to send your spaceship into space, and any enemy spaceships you run into, you can capture them, bring home their crew, and bring home their whatever's on board the spaceship, and you get to keep half of it.
Bounty,
the other half goes to the government.
Uh-huh.
That's what was going on in the 1700s and 1800s on wooden ships. If Spain was
so basically, I become the Han Solo of space. I just with the approval from the government.
Except you have a letter from the government saying it's okay.
a get out of jail free card. Yeah, I like it.
You are not Blackbeard. You are Sir Walter Raleigh.
Ooh, I get to be a sir.
Yeah,
Heck
you get to be a legitimate sailor who has a letter from his king or his queen, or in some cases from Parliament, that says we have permission from the government. So if Spain and England are at war and the King of England issues a letter of marque and reprisal to a sea captain, that sea captain gets to go out, and if he can find a Spanish ship, he can conquer that Spanish ship, he can capture that Spanish ship, he can run it aground, capture all the people on board, and keep
because you're at war.
They're at war. Yeah. They're at war. Keep the people that they capture for ransom. And sometimes if you capture the right Spanish ship, you might have a bunch of chests of doubloons in there. Ooh, and you end up being pretty darn rich if you capture the right Spanish ship that's coming back from somewhere in South America full of gold from Latin America.
Okay.
So what's the difference? Why is it called a letter of marque and reprisal? Well, the short answer is reprisal is the definition of marque in French. So it's
redundant again?
It's redundant again. It is saying a letter of reprisal and reprisal. They were called letters of marque and that's all you need to say because everybody knew what that meant back in the 1700s. But it became clarified that it was letters of marque and reprisal. And the idea being if those bad guys over there on the other side of the ocean were attacking your ships, we're going to get our revenge, we're going to get a reprisal against them. We're going to attack them. And the way we're going to not just have our Navy do it, but anybody who wants to get a private ship together, put some cannons on it and go steal the enemy's ships and interfere with their merchant shipping, have at it, boys. We're going to go let you do it. And here's your official big parchment piece of permission.
Two things. First of all, it's kind of the sea version of guerrilla warfare, because you're not going to be identified as always an enemy ship a lot of times. So it's, we have a way of not being identified, but also
So that's actually an interesting point, Clint. So let's cover that for a second.
Okay.
To effectively, legally, under international law, use your letter of marque, could you fly false colors?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm saying yes, because I want to win.
And the general rule under international law is no.
Damn it.
That if a pirate, that makes you a pirate, is flying false colors.
Yeah.
Flying your own country's flag and kind of putting it in a weird place that's hard to see might be a plan. But if you have a letter of reprisal or a letter of marque, you're not supposed to be doing dishonorable things like flying the flag of an ally of the guy that you're trying to capture.
Well, that's bullcrap.
Well, it's back in the day.
I get it, Marcus of Queensberry rules type stuff. It's no kicking below the waist, whatever.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
My second question was this, and I'm assuming it was, but that's the reason I'm asking the smart person. When we didn't really have a Navy, is this how we actually facilitated a little bit of offense and defense on the seas?
Absolutely.
Okay, because we didn't have a Navy for quite a while. We had ships, but we didn't have a Navy to compete with.
Yeah, there was a famous naval writer, what's his name, John Thayer Mahan, who wrote about how important it was to interfere with the commerce of your enemies, and whether it was your full Navy fleet going up and stopping the enemy's ships of commerce, or whether you send out individual Navy ships that roam around, say, the Pacific and capture whaler ships, or they go over to the English Channel and try to capture English ships that are just trying to be transports. Or you could also use privateers to do the same thing. The idea is it Alfred Thayer Mahan? I'll look it up later. Anyway, it was a major naval thinker, and one of the ideas is you do commerce raiding. That's what the smaller Navy does. The country with a smaller Navy is they split up their ships and attack the other side's commerce. And you can do it either with officially flagged Navy ships that are full of sailors who are sworn in and officers who are commissioned by that Navy, by that country, or you can send out privateers. Clint, you could build your own ship and you could put your cannons on it and you could raise a crew. And if you get that all put together, the Congress passes a law granting you a letter of marque, and you have official government permission to go attack whoever our enemy is right now.
The commerce. So my question, this is a stretch, and then I want you to get into the meat of the thing. But like we see this now happening around different seas and ports and straits and around the world right now, where you'll have basically pirates attacking commercial trade ships to affect the countries. Like our prices are going to go up. Transportation gets a little wonky if we can't use certain passages. So is that kind of the same thing? Like they're out there and they're attacking the commercial vessels, right? The trade vessels. If you think about
those are pirates.
Yeah.
Unless the government of Somalia has given them explicit permission, and then they are privateers.
Yeah.
But then we can also say that Somalia's government's an outlaw government for doing that. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. So hold that
okay.
thought.
Look at me actually being relevant, not knowing it. All right, Eric, you take us and run, buddy.
All right. So the first point, let's just talk for a second about the big picture, what the founding fathers meant by putting this in Article 1, Section 8, and what have scholars and politicians and judges, what have they argued about? What's the point of having this clause? The whole clause read together, Congress will have the power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. There are two groups of people that have argued. One, that by putting the power to declare war and grant letters of marque and reprisal and make rules of captures on land and water, that was meant to say that any ability to engage in conflict falls under the power of Congress. So remember last time we talked about the power to declare war, but the president's commander in chief of the military.
Mhm.
So if we're attacked, obviously the president can defend us right away. But can the president just send foreign troops to a foreign country? Could the president decide on his own to send troops to Ukraine? Could the president decide on his own to send troops to Iraq or Afghanistan? Does he need Congress to approve that? And the ability of Congress to declare war is the official declaration of war, and that gives the president a lot of authority. But if it's less than a declaration of war, remember we talked about this last time,
90 days, right?
60 days.
60 days. Yeah.
60 days. Yeah. And it's called the War Powers Act. The president can act for up to 60 days under the War Powers Act. What the Congress has only declared war, we said this 5 times: War of 1812, Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II.
I got 2 of those 5. Yes.
Every other conflict that we've been in has been one where maybe Congress approved it after the fact, but the president went and got something started. So here's the point why the rest of this clause matters. Does adding after declare war also the power to grant letters of marque and reprisal and make rules concerning capture on land and water? Is that to suggest that that covers all the possible rules about hostilities that could be made, and therefore it all falls under Congress? Or for those people who would argue that the president should have more power, they say no. Declaration of war, Congress can do that. Letters of marque and reprisal are this tiny little power to give a privateer ship captain the authority to go out and attack enemy merchant vessels. And captures on land and water is this technical thing about what to do with the property of the enemy when we captured it. And the rest of it is left up to the president. So that is the debate. And frankly, Clint, what we talked about last time with the War Powers Act and the fact that most presidents have gone along with the War Powers Act but have never agreed that it's constitutional, this is an open question.
Right.
The open question today is, where does Congress's authority to get us into hostilities and approve the hostilities end, and where does the president's begin? And
But
the
that's
things
kind
that
of the question about all this stuff, isn't it?
it is, but this
Yeah.
one's an open question historically.
Mhm.
Certainly, Congress has the power to stop funding something.
Mhm.
That's how we got out of Vietnam. Basically, is Congress stopped spending money, allowing the United States to spend money on military forces in Vietnam. That essentially forced us to get out. So it's just an open question. Where's that line drawn? One of the other things that allows Congress to do is
Excuse me.
basically outsource war fighting. We don't have to always go through our military. We can hire contractors. That's basically what a privateer is. It's
Mhm.
a Navy contractor to go out and do some fighting. But at the
By
end
the
of
way, real quick, side note, do you know when the last time we issued a letter of marque?
it was last used during the War of 1812.
God
That's my
damn
next
it.
paragraph I was about to
God
get to.
darn it. Jeez almighty. Never mind. I'm
Yeah.
just trying to be smart. Go for it, man. My bad.
Um, so the bottom line is Congress can control the purse. And yes, and the next thing I was going to ask is if you knew when the last time we'd issued a letter of marque.
I do, but it really came up real quick. Do you know Rand Paul kind of had suggested this a while back, like 2009 or 10, like we should start doing this. Anyway, I think that's kind of unique.
Yeah, so we'll get to that in a second. So let's first
Okay.
talk about the history of it. So the last time Congress actually issued a letter of marque was during the War of 1812. We had a relatively small navy, and it still made sense to basically authorize some private sea captain or ship owner to outfit a ship, turn it into a navy vessel, basically what looks like a pirate ship, and go attack the merchant vessels of the enemy. In the War of 1812, we were fighting the British, and so the idea of taking out British ships and capturing their goods.
Mm-hmm.
There was some talk of doing the same thing in the 1830s under Andrew Jackson, late 1820s, I think. Andrew Jackson, they discussed issuing letters of marque, but they never did after the War of 1812. Here's the big thing that changed the why this kind of has gone away. The Declaration of Paris is kind of the equivalent of the Geneva Convention, and it was an international law passed in 1856 saying letters of marque are illegal.
Oh.
So under international law, you can no longer let civilians go out and attack your
Did we
enemy.
vote for that too?
We did not.
Well, then we don't have. Listen, we're America. They don't screw them.
We did
the hell?
not, which leads us to the question of, so if we're not actually a signatory to that,
Yeah.
and we're not going to use it against somebody who we kind of recognize under international law, we don't want to pick that fight with, could we issue letters of marque to some of these shipping companies to have the authority to fight the Somali pirates?
Yes.
I think the answer probably is yes, and I think
Yeah.
that was what
We have a right to protect our crap. I have no time for this international stuff. Dadgummit. Until I need them or want them, and then I like it. But go
And
ahead.
it's also been something that's been featured in speculative fiction. What if the president turned out to be somebody who was so afraid of fighting that we were about to be attacked by an enemy, but Congress recognized the threat? Could Congress issue a letter of marque to the Navy to go fight the enemy's Navy? That's there's been some novels about that. I've read a couple. Yeah. All right. So,
hey, by the way, we need to be careful with novels that we dismiss, because I have found those novels of fiction become reality in about 20 to 30 years. But keep going, sir. Don't just dismiss that. Go back and read those books, sir. Tell us what to expect in the next 20 years.
Exactly.
Go for it.
Okay. So the last part of the clause, Congress will have the power to make rules concerning captures on land and water. One of the questions the founding fathers didn't really answer in their notes, and we don't know for sure, is, does it apply only to private property, or does it apply to private property and to capturing enemy personnel, to prisoners of war? So I'm going to just lay these out. Here's the three arguments the people trying to interpret what the founding fathers meant. One, the clause applies only to property, not to persons, and therefore the power over enemy prisoners rests with the president as commander-in-chief. So deciding what to do with POWs is entirely up to the military.
But this isn't just on the water, right?
No, it's captures on land and water. So if we get in a war with Mexico and we capture some Mexicans, who gets to set the rules for what we do with those POWs?
Okay. I see.
Is it the military through the president, or is it Congress passing laws?
Wow. Well, we got him. He's the commander in chief.
He is. That's the argument.
Yeah.
So argument number one is this clause only applies to property, and the commander in chief has control over POWs.
Right.
Argument number two, that the clause only applies to property, not to people, not to POWs. But then Congress could regulate the treatment of prisoners via its authority to issue regulations that govern the armed forces, so that Congress can still pass laws about it, not under this clause, but under a different clause.
Okay.
Or three, this clause does apply to POWs, to prisoners, and Congress has the additional authority through the offenses against the law of nations and declare war clauses, which we've already talked about, to pass laws about POWs. Those are the three different arguments that are going around. So originally in the Articles of Confederation, Article 9 of the Articles of Confederation vested Congress the power of establishing rules for deciding in all cases what captures on land or water shall be legal, and in what manner prizes taken by land or naval forces in the service of the United States shall be divided or appropriated. So part of this that's important to understand is there used to be this concept that if you were in the Navy and you captured an enemy merchant vessel, nowadays we would essentially say that you capture that enemy vessel and you turn it over to the Navy and turn it over to the United States, and basically it's just property of the United States.
Right.
Back in the old days, in the wooden ship days, it was very normal to say, you're a U.S. Navy ship captain, we're going to encourage you to capture enemy vessels, and if you do, when we sell it, you get a certain portion of the prize money. So it might be half of it goes to the U.S. government, a third goes to you, and the other 6 is divided up under a formula where the first mate gets a big percentage and the crew gets a small percentage, but it could still be real money.
I saw that in the Last Kingdom. It's talking about on Netflix. It's the old medieval times. They were talking about they worked out a deal with the Saxons, and they said, "Okay, we will come help you fight, but my men get the spoils of war off the battlefield." And then they sit there and argued about what percentages that would be. And so they kind of did the same thing. They were like, yeah, we'll bring you in. You then are under our flag. Your folks will be under our flag, and you get the spoils of war. But here's the percentages. Anyway, I think it's pretty cool.
Right. And we especially used to do it with Navy ships capturing merchant ships. And basically the point is this, that under the Articles of Confederation, it was clearly set up that Congress could create the rules to decide how to calculate the prize money, and how to, most importantly, calculate how it would be split up. Okay.
Okay.
So that's why this was put in the Constitution clearly, to at least cover that, to make sure that it still apply, that the Congress still has the power over property seized during war. So the founding fathers, really, part of the problem is they didn't say much else about this. The Congress did issue letters of marque and reprisal during the American Revolution.
Right.
And so we're looking at this historically and basically saying, we wish the founding fathers had written more about this, because it's hard to tell, but clearly it covers property. So let's go ahead and talk about what a couple cases have been tried to interpret this. Here's the interesting one that from the old days, I think is just kind of a fascinating example of how this kind of stuff first started getting worked out. So remember that we declared our independence in 1776. We basically became a free country in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. We wrote the Constitution in 1789. We passed the Bill of Rights in 1791. So we finally had a working constitution as a free and independent country in 1791. 21 years later, we get into the War of 1812, and we're off fighting the British. And it's our first real war. It's our first declared war. The British are thinking that America is such a weak country that they can do things like pull our ships over on the open seas, and they can take our sailors by claiming that those sailors are actually still Irish or English or Scottish citizens, and that they can be impressed back into the British Navy, when in fact they may have been born in America, or at least they lived in America long enough they became U.S. citizens. And basically, the British were bullying us around on the open ocean, and that's how we ended up declaring war against them. It also happens that in 1814, the wars with Napoleon were still going on, and the British were a little preoccupied. So if there's ever a time between 1812 and 1814 for us to get into a war with Great Britain, 1812 was, I said 1814 a second ago, it's 1812. It was the War of 1812, and Britain was very occupied fighting Napoleon.
Right.
So we get in there at the same time. All right. So here's an example of how this works out in terms of Congress deciding what to do with the spoils of war. In Savannah, Georgia, an American ship was owned by an American, was hired by a British company to ship 550 tons of pine timber, 12,000 staves, and 18 tons of lathwood. A crap load of wood that they wanted to take back to Great Britain. And remember, this is a time when in America, even though we're a country, all the factories were in Great Britain. We kind of were the source of raw materials. So this British company wanted to buy a boatload of wood, essentially,
Right.
literally a boatload of wood, 550 tons of pine timber, 12,000 staves, and 18 tons of lathwood. They were loaded on April 9th of 1812 in Savannah, and the ship left for Plymouth, England on April 18th. A storm came up, and the ship was not too far out into the ocean, so the best place for them to go back to was back to America, and the closest place they could go to was New Bedford, Connecticut. So they pull back into New Bedford, Connecticut. What they find out when they get back to New Bedford, Connecticut, was that on April 4th, 1812, the United States Congress had declared war against Great Britain. They didn't get that word before they left Savannah. That the news hadn't traveled that far that fast. But when they get back to Connecticut, they find out that the United States is at war. And so here's this American ship, but it's got a cargo of British goods. What do you do with British goods when you're at war with Great Britain?
Sell them and take the money.
Well, that's what some people would claim. So what ended up happening?
Use them. Why not?
So the agent who purchased the wood on behalf of the British company originally was actually an American. So he was working for the British company.
He's a broker.
He was a broker. He was the agent. He says to the captain when they get to Connecticut and we find out we're at war, he says, "Well, I can't make you go to Great Britain, but I don't know what we should do with this. I purchased this for my company
Yeah.
that I work for back in Great Britain. Can we agree to unload it? And we sign a document that we will unload it with no prejudice to the British merchants. In other words, that we will agree that this is not a concession, that this can't eventually go to Great Britain when we work all this out." So they signed that document.
Okay.
They unload it. And while it's unloaded, the agent's thinking, well, this war is going to keep dragging on. So he sells the timber, the American agent, but he's working for the British company, sells it to another American, a Mr. Brown. The stuff is sitting in a warehouse, and also some of it's actually, they stashed it in a creek. Apparently that was the way to keep the wood wet so that it would actually be preserved better. And over that winter, Mr. Brown purchases it in November of 1812. In 1813, in April, about a year after war is declared, about 11 months after the ship is pulled into New Bedford, Connecticut, Mr. Delano, the original owner of the ship, seizes the timber and says, "This is property of a British company. It was British property when it was taken off my ship. It never should have been sold." And he claims it as a prize of war.
For Britain.
He claims it as a prize of war for America.
For America. Okay. Yeah.
Because he's an American and he owns the American
ship.
ship.
Okay, now I'm with you. Yeah.
Right? Okay, so he's American. He owns the ship. What's the problem is that the agent for the British company, also an American, but he's the agent for the British company, had already sold it to Mr. Brown. So the agent got the money for the wood, but Mr. Brown didn't get the wood.
So give the money back.
And then Mr. Delano claims the wood for himself and that Mr. Brown can't have it.
So I give the money back to this guy and I go fist fight the other dude.
But Mr. Delano doesn't have the money.
Oh.
The agent for the British company has the money.
That's what I'm saying. The agent should pay the money back to the guy he sold the wood to and then go fist fight the guy on the boat for it. That's what I'm saying. But go for it. You tell me what really should happen.
Well, the agent's saying, we got a fair and square deal. I sold the timber to Mr. Brown and we got his money, and Mr. Brown has the wood. That's the way it should be. Yeah. It's Mr. Delano that shouldn't be taking the wood. But he's, hey, we're at war with Great Britain. This case gets all the way to the Supreme Court.
Wow. Okay.
And in the Supreme Court, the court actually rules that Mr. Brown can keep the wood and Mr. Delano should not seize it. And the key ruling is Congress has the power to write rules about the capture of property on land and war, but they hadn't actually written any rules about seizing British property during the War of 1812. And without any special rules from Congress, the default rule is that ordinary property rights apply and you can't seize the enemy's property.
Okay.
So Congress has the power to write a rule saying you could have seized the British property, but they didn't write that law, and therefore it still belongs to that British company. And all the normal
we can change
rules,
it moving forward, but we can't go back in time.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
Okay, I'm with you.
All right. The other Supreme Court case, we're going to skip ahead to just a few years back. Some of our younger listeners may not remember that much about 9/11, but you and I both were around when that happened. You and I were playing rugby together when that happened.
Yeah, we sure were.
I remember the first rugby practice and we got back together right after 9/11 and how weird that felt.
I remember, just real quick, a side note, about 6 months to a year later, we went and played the 101st Airborne up in Kentucky, and they were 2 weeks away from shipping out.
Yeah.
And after our game, we all got together and kind of said a little prayer and hugged them. And it was we bought all the beer that day.
Yeah.
We bought all the beer that day. So anyway,
yep. Yeah. And then we sent them off. So
absolutely.
A few years later, the war against terror happened. And we go to Iraq and we go to Afghanistan. And what ends up happening in Afghanistan is we end up capturing a bunch of Al-Qaeda people. And the decision is made, rather than to put them in POW camps in Afghanistan or bring them back to the United States and prosecute them under ordinary criminal law as terrorists under United States law. The decision is made to take them to Guantanamo Bay. Now, let's talk for just 1 second about Guantanamo Bay. Cuba belongs to the Castros and is a communist country on an island in the Caribbean. Fidel Castro is now dead, but he was alive at the time. Cuba is allies with Russia and formerly the Soviet Union. Cuba has been controlled by communists basically since Fidel Castro took over in 1960. So, what the hell are we doing in Cuba? Well, way back when, during the Spanish American War, we took over a piece of land around a port on the southeast side of Cuba. And where a river runs into the ocean, we turned that into a Navy base. And we started renting that from Cuba for $3,000 a year.
Mm.
When Fidel Castro took over, we didn't close that Navy base. We just locked the gate. Now, for a long time, there were certain Cuban citizens who were still allowed to come on the base when they had jobs on base. Like literally some of the gardeners and some of the cooks and people that had civilian jobs could still come through the gate every day. But Guantanamo is basically 10 square miles of U.S. military base, but it's on a foreign country. It's on Cuba. If you've ever seen the movie A Few Good Men, that's where Tom Cruise goes down to investigate where the Marines, a Marine was killed, right? And Jack Nicholson is the guy who basically says, my people are standing on that wall, regarding that wall. Well, that's the wall around Guantanamo base. So the president and his team make the decision in the early OOs that when we've captured these terrorists, we don't want to have the possibility of having them be released. We don't want to risk the possibility of our secrets getting out about what we're finding out about, how we find out about their terrorism, that they shouldn't get the full due process of law that they would if they were U.S. citizens or if they were captured in the United States. So we don't want to take them back to the United States. So we take them to Guantanamo. And then Congress ends up passing a law that basically allows the military to prosecute these terrorists under military commissions, basically military tribunals, but with a brand new set of rules. They don't follow the UCMJ and they don't follow regular criminal law.
Mm-hmm.
And that case gets all the way to the Supreme Court. And here's what the Supreme Court says ultimately in 2006. That one more thing. Included in the law is language that says, and anybody who wants to sue about this or complain about this, that the DC Circuit Court of Appeals has exclusive jurisdiction.
Oh,
so does that mean the Supreme Court could even hear it? So the Supreme Court, first of all, decides, yes, if you appeal it to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, unless it expressly says, and there's no further appeal, then it's clear the Supreme Court can hear appeals from the DC Circuit Court of Appeals just like we normally would.
right.
Because a case goes to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, that's one step below the Supreme Court. If somebody wants to appeal a decision they don't like from the DC Court of Appeals, they have the right to ask the Supreme Court to hear their case.
It just falls under the normal processes.
So it falls under the normal process. So that's like number one they ruled. That the president lacked either the constitutional power or congressional authorization to establish these military commissions. So Congress at first hadn't even set them up, and the power of the presidency could not establish military commissions. That absent such authority, the military commissions had to comply with the ordinary laws of the United States and of war, which included the UCMJ and the Geneva Conventions, which had been incorporated. So when Congress eventually set up these military commissions, sort of approved them, they didn't give full authority to do what the White House was doing. And these particular military commissions had not been authorized. And so what that boiled down to was Congress can decide what the rules are for captures on land and war. And if that applies to people, then clearly Congress has the right to set up what the rules are going to be. But whether it applies to people or not, the president does not have the power to ignore the ordinary laws that govern what we do with POWs. So we have to either follow civilian criminal law
Or
or the UCMJ, including the Geneva Convention.
right.
The president cannot make up new procedures.
You don't want all that power in one place to all of a sudden just circumnavigate rules, like you said, for civilians or people who are in part of war or military. Right.
Yep. The one part the president won, though, was what about just holding these people indefinitely without
Yes.
charging them with
You
anything?
got that one right.
And the Supreme Court said, yes, the president won that. Here's what they said. The detention of enemy combatants for the duration of the conflict is so fundamental and accepted an incident to war as to be an exercise of the necessary and appropriate force Congress has authorized the president to use. And basically, they didn't even say whether Congress needed to approve it. It's just part of what the president's war powers are,
Right.
is to maintain POWs as long as it's a legitimate. As long as it's a legitimate
So real
war.
quick, and because I know we're running up on the end on this. So I've got war powers, 60 days. At the end of that, I have to go to Congress to make sure I can keep getting funding and it's still part of it. What if I don't get the funding? Does that mean that my rights and power to hold those prisoners are gone?
So that's a good question. The argument that I would make if I was attorney citing this, and the name of the case again is, I'm going to make sure we get this right. It's Hamden v. Rumsfeld.
Okay.
Hamden was one of the prisoners. Rumsfeld was obviously the Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush. All right, so let's get it. So if I was
I shouldn't have asked that question.
No, it's a great question. So if I'm arguing in that case, depending on what side I'm on, I'm an attorney. I'll make the best arguments for my side. But the argument would be that we go to war. The Congress does not.
Congress hadn't
declared war or authorized further force. So the president stops in less than 60 days. Whether or not he can keep prisoners from that war when that war has in fact ended,
that's right.
Is an open question.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that unless Congress passes something that says affirmatively that war is ended and was not authorized, we're not going to pay for it anymore, the president could still argue, hey, Congress hasn't told me no, and I'm allowed to keep these prisoners. I think that might be a reasonable default rule, but I also think it's a very open question that the Supreme Court might have to deal with someday. If Congress,
at some point in time, because if I'm defunded and they've said we are not going to allow you to keep going in the next 60 days, does that mean my power to hold those prisoners in they need to be let go and sent back to their homelands?
Or turned over to the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
That might be the right solution.
Default.
Yeah. Is if you don't have authority to keep them as POWs,
then you start the process.
You turn them over to the criminal justice system and you prosecute them for being the terrorists that they are.
You think they are? You can do it that way. Okay. Yeah. All right.
So, cool. But it's a little bit of an open question. And again, reading this in big picture, the one thing that is kind of an open question is the president. Different presidents, multiple presidents have all said, we'll comply with the War Powers Act and we won't do this for more than 60 days without Congress's permission. But we don't actually agree that as commander in chief, I need to do that limit.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't like it, cut off my funding. But if I go more than 60 days, it's not unconstitutional. That law can't limit my ability to do that. That's an open question under the Constitution. What exactly the president can still do.
I think a lot of people, just between me and you, they just turn their heads and keep, we get distracted with so many other things. We forget a lot of times we're places that have never really been given the proper process and due procedures. But that's just Clint's opinion. There's me sprinkling my stupid opinion again.
So we still have coming up over the next couple episodes, we're going to be talking about the next clauses, and they have to do with raising an army, providing for a navy, and making rules for the government and regulations of the land and naval forces. So we'll be talking military stuff for a little while, for a couple more podcasts at least.
Good. There's questions I have. I think a lot of us civilians need to know more behind the scenes on this stuff. We get lost in the headlines, and it's good for us to know all of these things, sir. All right, man. This was a good one. Thank you, buddy.
Yeah, thanks, Clint. Good job today. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. See you, everybody. See you next week.
All right. Bye.